welcome to our virtual Q&A. My name is Julia Fell and I'm the assistant curator at the museum at Bethel Woods. I'm also this year's special exhibition curator. So what is the special exhibit for 2020? Well, it's a really cool collection of psychedelic posters and fashion items from 1960 San Francisco, and the title of the exhibit is Lights, Color, Fashion, Posters and Patterns of 1960 San Francisco. So I've got a bunch of questions here that we gathered from the audience, and I'm going to be answering them throughout this video. The first question I have is, what drew the museum staff to this subject? Well, the topic of the exhibit being psychedelia, this really wonderful explosion of color and culture that was happening during the 1960s, is really relevant to what we do at the museum at Bethel Woods. We are located at the historic site of the Woodstock Festival, but we really interpret the entire decade of the 1960s. So everything that was going on in San Francisco, Summer of Love, 1967, the Haight-Ashbury district, all of that culture was traveling all across the country, and a lot of what we were seeing on the streets of the Haight-Ashbury migrated and was taking place in 1969 in Max Yasgur's farm as well. The way we ended up with this particular exhibit was the exhibition lender and co-curator, Gary Westford, approached us a few years ago and said, hey, I've got this really amazing collection of posters and fashion that I started collecting in the 1960s in San Francisco when I lived there. Do you want to put it on exhibit? And we were like, yes, please. And we took a look at his collection, and it really is truly stupendous. The posters are so colorful, so well designed. They're by some of the best artists of that time, known in the poster making field. And the fashion is also really something special, from the street fashion of hippie, handmade, organic clothing to really some extraordinary designer pieces inspired by psychedelia. We were really excited to have the opportunity to put this show on display and share it with all of our visitors. The second question I've sort of answered a little bit already, but what kind of art will we see in this exhibit? So there's three different types of art that you're going to see in Lights, Color, Fashion. The first, as I mentioned, is the posters. There are almost 70 posters in this show. Most of them are advertising music concerts and dance concerts that were held in some of the well-known venues in San Francisco during the 1960s, like the Fillmore and the Avalon Ballroom. You might have heard of those venues. And they're just really incredible. If you've ever heard of the Big Five poster artists, they are well represented in this show, and if you have never heard of them, then you should definitely come see the show and learn all about them and their contemporaries, because there's just some really incredible, trailblazing, really colorful, mind-bending art, and I think everyone's really gonna love it. The next type of art that you're gonna see, as I also mentioned, is fashion. So there was an explosion of new fashion coming out of San Francisco during the 1960s and early 1970s that was influenced by the psychedelic counterculture aesthetic that was evolving at that time. So in this show we have this incredible handmade, beautiful hippie clothing with mirror embroidery and fringe and all this great stuff. And then we also have fashion from designers like Betsy Johnson and Emilio Pucci. So the psychedelic culture and look was really traveling up to those upper echelons of haute couture. So the fashion in the show is really special. You get that whole range of what was being seen on the street and really across the world, influenced by the styles of San Francisco. The last type of art that you're going to see is something really special. So in 1960 San Francisco, the music, concert, dance halls were hosting some of the biggest performers of the time, like Big Brother and the Holding Company and Jefferson Airplane. All these bands coming out of San Francisco were performing at those venues. And while they were providing the musical entertainment, there was another type of performance going on in those venues during those concerts, and that was the new art form of the light show. So if you've never seen a light show before, it's this really spectacular, once in a lifetime, unique, on the spot type of art form where an artist is projecting imagery onto the stage, and they are using colored oils and dyes and mirrors and projections and all sorts of cool patterns to create a new environment around not only the musical performers, but in the case of 1960 San Francisco, a lot of times the projections were actually in the entire room, so the audience was immersed. And we have a little bit of that in our show. We have a light show produced by Bill Ham. Mr. Ham was a light artist, really a pioneer, trailblazer of light art in San Francisco. He was the one who was in those concert halls projecting his art for the audience. And we have a show from him that's going to be projected in our exhibit, and we really hope that everyone will come be mesmerized by it, just like everyone was back in the day. So we're really excited to be able to include a really special light show from Bill Ham. The next question I have is, what is the process to determine if a poster or piece of clothing is real to the time period? Well, in this case, with this show, we know that a lot of the art was actually collected by our lender in the 1960s in San Francisco. And he, was taking the posters basically right off the street. These posters were hung up to advertise the concerts, and he came along and said, that's cool. And, just like many other people would take the poster down off of the wall or wherever it was. So basically, we know that he collected those things right on the spot. And he has so much experience and is such a passionate collector that anything he's collected since, he recognizes the authenticity of it, just as a museum curator would. A lot of the objects in the collection at the museum at Bethel Woods are in a similar situation where they were donated to the museum by the original owners, so someone who either removed the object from the street or purchased it in a shop or made it themselves. So we know, because there's only one step of ownership there, they have a really strong provenance, which basically means proof of history. So many of our objects have really good provenance because they come from their original owners. Besides that, any other objects you might acquire, museum curators are trained to recognize authentic materials, and we do this by conducting a lot of research about where a particular object came from, as well as looking at the object in detail. Sometimes we got to take out our magnifying glass and look at little details like printing methods or stitching on clothing, and get a really good intimate feel for what that object is. And usually by doing those things, we can tell if an object is authentic or not. Our next question is, what does psychedelia really mean? This show has a lot of, we're throwing the word psychedelia around a lot, which is a really fun word to say, really hard word to spell. Psychedelia refers to a culture, really. It's an aesthetic of music, art, fashion that came from this emerging culture. And it was often inspired by some experiences that people may have had back in the day of using hallucinogenic substances to trigger experiences where colors and patterns are enhanced. Today, psychedelia has left such a legacy. We have so many pieces of art and fashion and music that were inspired by that time period that you can really experience it just by looking at that art, listening to that music. And one of the ways you can do that, you can really experience psychedelia, is by coming to see our special exhibit. So if you're curious, I really hope that you come to visit and you'll get an idea of what it's all about. Next question is, what was it like working with the lender and co-curator for this exhibit? So our lender and co-curator, as I mentioned, is Gary Westford, who when he was in his 20s was going to college and living in San Francisco, and started his collection at that time. So he's had 50 years to build a really incredible collection of art and fashion from that time period. So when we started the process, we really started very early on having a lot of discussions with Gary. And right away, his excitement and passion for the 1960s and early 1970s in San Francisco was incredible. I mean, working with somebody who lived that history and is really still so excited about it was a really wonderful way to kick off the planning for this exhibit. And Gary was in 100% from the beginning. Just really can't express how much his enthusiasm really shaped how this exhibit moved forward. So it was really a pleasure working with him for that reason. but also because he was there, I got the chance to talk to somebody who had firsthand experience, and being able to do that, to hear those stories firsthand, is such a valuable asset. It adds another layer than you could really get just from reading about it in a book. So it's really incredible privilege to get to work with Gary in that respect as well. And finally, Gary set us up with Bill Ham, the light artist, who I spoke about earlier, and getting to speak with Mr. Ham and hear his stories, and also the immense privilege of getting to show his art in the show is just so amazing. And I really have to thank Gary for getting that connection all set up and making sure that the light show is an integral part of the exhibit from the beginning. Now I have one final question here. What is your favorite part of the exhibit? I always have such a hard time answering these types of questions because I am so involved with the exhibit from beginning to end that really each object is my favorite in its own way. But I'll try to come up with an answer. I have two responses. First, the fashion is kind of my favorite because my background is actually in costume design and textile history. I was a theater major in college doing costume design, and I have a real soft spot for historical fashion and any type of fashion. So it was really exciting and really a good treat for me to get to work with the fashion in this exhibit, and I'm really excited for everyone to get to see it. I think that fashion is a really accessible entry point for a lot of people into history. You can imagine yourself wearing clothing, or if you really fall in love with a piece of clothing, it lets you imagine that you were in that time and place where that piece of clothing was created. So I'm really excited about the fashion. And my second answer to that question, what's your favorite part of the exhibit, was actually sort of a surprise to me. We have a selection of blacklight posters that are highlighted in their own little room with the black lights turned way up so you can see every little detail. And the second that we turned those black lights on for the first time and saw those posters in their space, it was really mind-blowing. I mean, they just sing. And I think that anyone who comes to see the exhibit is really, really gonna love the blacklight room. Well, that's all the questions that I have for today. Thank you for joining us. Once again, my name is Julia Fell. I'm the assistant curator at the museum at Bethel Woods and the curator of this year's special exhibit, Lights, Color, Fashion, Posters and Patterns of 1960s San Francisco. I hope that you come visit the exhibit.